A single coin destroyed the greatest empire in history. Not a barbarian sword, not a plague, a coin, debased, devalued, and deadly. Rome didn't fall to invaders, it bankrupted itself first. And the warning signs? They're appearing again today. To understand how Rome destroyed itself, we must first understand what made it invincible. At its height, in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire wasn't just a military superpower, it was a financial machine unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. From the tin mines of Britannia to the spice markets of Syria, from the olive groves of Hispania to the wheat fields of Egypt, wealth flowed into Rome like tributaries feeding a vast river. The Mediterranean wasn't just Rome's lake, it was Rome's cash register. But this wealth didn't accumulate by accident. Rome had engineered something revolutionary, a standardized monetary system that spanned 3 continents. The gold aureus and silver denarius weren't just coins, they were trust made tangible. In 64 AD, under Nero, the denarius contained 3.9 grams of pure silver, nearly 98% purity. The aureus held 7.3 grams of gold. These weren't arbitrary numbers, they represented a promise. Rome's money was real, backed by precious metal, accepted from Germania to Arabia. This monetary stability created economic integration on a scale not seen again until the modern era. A merchant in Londinium could trade with a supplier in Alexandria using the same currency. A soldier stationed in Judea received the same denarius as his counterpart guarding the Rhine. This was Rome's true genius, not just conquest, but economic cohesion. The system was brilliantly simple. Provinces paid taxes in silver and gold. These coins circulated back through military salaries, government spending, and imperial construction projects. The velocity of money created prosperity. Markets thrived. Cities expanded. The archaeological record doesn't lie. Pottery shards, building inscriptions, and coin hoards all tell the same story. The 1st and 2nd centuries AD were Rome's economic golden age. But every golden age contains the seeds of its own destruction. Rome's wealth was built on a dangerous assumption that expansion would never end. Every new province brought tribute. Every military victory brought plunder. Every conquest paid for the next. The machine worked. The turning point arrived not with drama, but with silence. By the mid-2nd century, Rome's borders had stopped expanding. Emperor Hadrian, pragmatic and cautious, built walls instead of conquering new territories. His successors largely maintained rather than expanded. The age of easy conquest was over. This created a financial problem that few Romans fully understood at the time. Their economy had become structurally dependent on the spoils of war. When expansion stopped, so did the primary source of new wealth entering the system. Meanwhile, the costs of empire continued to accelerate. The Roman military, once self-financing through conquest, became a permanent financial burden. By 200 AD, the empire maintained approximately 400,000 soldiers across its frontiers, the largest standing army the world had ever seen. Each soldier required not just salary, but equipment, supplies, and retirement benefits in the form of land grants. The numbers were staggering. A legionary's annual salary had risen from 225 denarii under Augustus to 300 denarii by the time of Domitian. This doesn't sound dramatic until you multiply it by hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Military spending consumed between 50 to 75% of the imperial budget, a ratio that would make modern defense ministers weep. But emperors couldn't simply cut military spending. The army wasn't just Rome's defense, it was the emperor's power base. Every emperor knew the truth whispered in the barracks: the army makes emperors. Reducing military pay was political suicide, often followed by actual suicide. So they looked elsewhere for savings. They found none. Administrative costs were rising.
The imperial bureaucracy had swollen into a vast apparatus of governors, tax collectors, clerks, accountants, and officials. Corruption, once occasional, had become systematic. Provincial governors saw their posts as investment opportunities, extracting enough to pay bribes for the empire also faced what economists today call the middle income trap. Once conquered provinces had been thoroughly exploited. The easy wealth, temple treasures, royal hoards, accessible mines, had been extracted. Maintaining revenue required squeezing provinces harder, but there were limits to how much could be taken before economic activity itself collapsed.
In Egypt, one of Rome's most valuable provinces, tax pressure became so severe that farmers began abandoning their land. In Gaul, archaeological evidence shows a decline in rural settlement density during the 3rd century. People were voting with their feet, fleeing the tax collector more desperately than they'd ever fled barbarian raids. And then came the emperors who accelerated Rome's financial suicide. In 211 AD, Emperor Caracalla made a decision that seemed generous but proved catastrophic, the Antonine Constitution, granting Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. Why was this financial suicide? Because Roman citizens were exempt from certain taxes that non-citizens paid. Overnight, the empire's tax base shrank dramatically. To compensate, Caracalla raised taxes on everything else and, critically, debased the currency. Currency debasement, it sounds technical, almost boring, but it's the financial equivalent of slow-motion civilizational suicide, and Rome embraced it with the desperation of an addict. Here's what happened. Emperors needed more money but couldn't raise taxes further without triggering revolts, so they found a shortcut. They reduced the precious metal content in coins while maintaining the same face value. It's ancient counterfeiting, made legal because the government did it. The numbers tell a horrifying story. Under Nero in 64 AD, the denarius was 98% silver. By the time Septimius Severus died in 211 AD, it was down to 50% silver. Under his son Caracalla, it dropped to 50%. By 260 AD, during the crisis of the 3rd century, the silver denarius contained less than 5% silver. It was essentially a copper coin with silver plating that wore off after a few months in circulation. Why did they do this? The mathematics were seductive. With half the silver, you could mint twice as many coins from the same amount of metal, double your money supply, pay your soldiers, and everything's fine. Except economics doesn't work that way. People aren't stupid. Merchants quickly realized that new coins contained less silver than old ones. They adjusted prices accordingly. A loaf of bread that cost 2 denarii now cost 4, not because wheat was scarcer, but because the denarius was worthless. This is inflation, and Rome discovered it the hard way. By the mid-3rd century, Rome experienced hyperinflation that would have impressed Weimar Germany. Prices increased not by percentages, but by multiples. Ancient historian Lactantius wrote that in some years, prices rose by 1,000%. Archaeological evidence from Egypt shows wheat prices increasing 30-fold between 250 and 280 AD. The social impact was catastrophic. Roman citizens who had saved money in coins watched their life savings evaporate. A merchant who had accumulated 10,000 denarii, enough to retire comfortably in 200 AD, found that same amount couldn't buy a month's groceries by 260 AD. The middle class, the backbone of Roman society, was financially annihilated. But the true horror was what economists call Gresham's law. Bad money drives out good money. People hoarded old coins with actual silver content and spent the debased new coins as quickly as possible. This created a vicious cycle. The good money disappeared from circulation. Only the worthless coins remained in the market, accelerating the collapse of economic trust. Archaeological coin hoards from this period tell the story. They contain old, high-quality coins buried by people who knew they were worth keeping. These hoards were never recovered. Their owners died, fled, or forgot where they'd hidden them. They're time capsules of financial panic. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome experienced what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century.
Crisis doesn't capture it. This was civilizational near death. In 50 years, Rome had more than 50 emperors. Most died violently. The average reign lasted less than 2 years. Generals proclaimed themselves emperor, murdered their predecessors, and were themselves murdered by the next general with enough loyal troops. This wasn't politics. It was an auction where the currency was promises of military pay that nobody could afford. Here's what political instability does to an economy. It destroys predictability. Merchants don't trade when they can't enforce contracts. Farmers don't plant when they don't know if they'll be taxed, conscripted, or killed before harvest. Investment, the foundation of economic growth, simply stops. The empire fractured. In 260 AD, the western provinces broke away to form the Gallic Empire. In the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra carved out her own kingdom. At one point, the Roman emperor controlled only Italy and parts of the Balkans. The Mediterranean economy, integrated for centuries, shattered into regional fragments.
Meanwhile, military spending spiraled beyond any rational level. Emperors, desperate to secure loyalty, kept raising soldiers' pay. Maximinus Thrax doubled military salaries in 235 AD, but he paid them in increasingly worthless coins. Soldiers understood what was happening. They demanded pay in gold or goods, anything but the official currency they were supposed to defend. This created an absurd situation. The Roman army no longer trusted Roman money. Legions mutinied when paid in debased denarii. Emperors resorted to paying in gold, but there wasn't enough gold. They melted down temple statues. They stripped bronze from public buildings. They confiscated private wealth. Nothing was enough. In 274 AD, something extraordinary happened. The mint workers in Rome itself went on strike. The people who made the money refused to make more of it. They understood better than anyone that they were being ordered to produce fraud. The strike turned violent. Emperor Aurelian suppressed it brutally, killing 7,000 mint workers. He then continued debasing the currency exactly as before. The economic breakdown became physical. Roman roads, the arterial system of commerce, fell into disrepair. Bridges collapsed and weren't rebuilt. The postal system, once efficient enough to deliver messages from Britain to Syria in weeks, broke down. Urban populations declined as cities couldn't maintain food supplies. Archaeological evidence shows once thriving towns shrinking, their outer neighborhoods abandoned, defensive walls built using stones from deconstructed public buildings. By the late 3rd century, Rome's emperors knew they had to do something. Their solutions, though well-intentioned, often made things worse. They discovered what governments throughout history keep rediscovering. You can't legislate away economic reality. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, perhaps the most ambitious price control system in ancient history. It set maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services, from wheat to lawyers' fees. The punishment for violating these prices was death. It failed spectacularly. When you cap prices below market rates, goods disappear. Farmers stopped bringing grain to market because they'd lose money at official prices. Merchants hoarded goods or sold them illegally at real market rates. Black markets flourished. The edict was so counterproductive that within a few years it was quietly abandoned. Diocletian's other solution was more successful, at least temporarily. He introduced the solidus, a new gold coin with standardized weight and purity. By 312 AD, under Constantine, the solidus became the cornerstone of a reformed currency system. It worked. The solidus remained stable for centuries. But here's the catch. The solidus was gold, and Rome didn't have enough gold for everyday transactions. It became a currency for large transactions, taxes, and military pay. But ordinary Romans still struggled with debased bronze coins for daily commerce. Rome had created a two-tiered economy, a stable gold currency for the rich and government, and worthless metal for everyone else. Constantine also reformed the tax system, making it harsher but more predictable. He introduced the chrysargyron, a tax on merchants and craftsmen paid in gold and silver every 5 years. The tax was so oppressive that many artisans abandoned their trades. Ancient sources describe fathers castrating their sons to exempt them from military service, which would otherwise make them eligible for military-related taxes. When economic pressure drives people to mutilate their children, the system has failed. By the 4th century, Rome's economy had fundamentally transformed from a dynamic market system into something closer to feudalism. With currency unreliable and trade collapsed, people reverted to land-based subsistence. The villa system emerged, large rural estates that were economically self-sufficient, producing their own food, tools, and goods. This was economic regression. The complex, monetized, specialized economy that had made Rome great was reverting to the localized barter economy that had existed before Rome. Progress was running backward. The Western Empire's final decades were economically bizarre. The government still existed, still collected taxes, still paid soldiers, but increasingly in goods rather than money. The monetary economy was dying, but the state apparatus shambled on like a zombie. In 410 AD, when Alaric and his Visigoths sacked Rome, they found a city still magnificent in architecture, but hollow economically. The temples still stood, but they'd been stripped of their precious metals decades earlier. The forums still bustled, but with reduced commerce. Rome was a stage set of its former self.
The barbarians didn't destroy Rome's economy. They inherited a corpse. By the time Romulus Augustulus, the last Western emperor, was deposed in 476 AD, the monetary system had been effectively dead for generations. The final empire wasn't conquered, it was liquidated. Now comes the uncomfortable part, recognizing the pattern in our own time. Rome's financial collapse wasn't caused by unique ancient circumstances. It was caused by decisions and dynamics that remain relevant today. Currency debasement? Modern governments don't literally reduce gold content in coins. They print money through quantitative easing, expanding the money supply to fund obligations they can't otherwise afford. The mechanism is different. The effect is identical. Your savings lose value and prices rise. The United States national debt currently exceeds $34 trillion. That's more than 120% of GDP, a ratio that would have terrified Roman emperors. And like Rome, we tell ourselves it's manageable, that we'll grow our way out of it, that the rules of economics don't apply to us because we are exceptional. Rome thought it was exceptional too. Every empire does. Military overspending? The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. Like Rome, we maintain a global military presence that requires constant, enormous funding. Like Rome, we've discovered that our military commitments are politically impossible to reduce, even when economically unsustainable. Political short-termism? Roman emperors who reigned for 2 years couldn't implement 20-year reforms. Modern politicians facing election cycles make the same calculations. Short-term relief, long-term disaster. Why fix the problem if you won't be in office when the bill comes due? The collapse of trust. Romans stopped believing their currency was worth anything. Today, trust in institutions, government, media, financial systems is at historic lows. When people stop trusting the system, they stop participating in it. They hoard gold, cryptocurrencies, real assets, anything but official money. Sound familiar? But history isn't destiny. Rome fell because it couldn't or wouldn't make necessary changes. Every reform came too late or was implemented half-heartedly. The empire had become too complex, too corrupt, too committed to failed policies to save itself. We have advantages Rome didn't. We understand economics better. We have historical examples. We have the ability to learn from the past. The question is, will we? Rome's collapse wasn't inevitable. At dozens of points across 3 centuries, different decisions could have altered the trajectory. If Commodus had maintained his father's fiscal discipline, if Caracalla hadn't debased the currency and granted universal citizenship simultaneously, if the 3rd century emperors had accepted smaller armies and less spending,
if Diocletian's reforms had come 50 years earlier, but they didn't, because the incentive structure made the wrong choices easier than the right ones, because the political costs of reform exceeded the visible economic costs of continuation, because humans are remarkably good at convincing themselves that this time will be different, that the rules don't apply, that we can manage just a little more debt, just a little more inflation, just a little more spending. The Roman Empire didn't fall to barbarians. It suffocated under the weight of its own financial contradictions: debased currency, unsustainable spending, political paralysis, and a refusal to accept difficult truths until accepting them was no longer possible. The barbarians who crossed Rome's borders in the 5th century didn't conquer an empire. They occupied a graveyard. The economic heart had stopped beating long before the political body stopped moving. We tell ourselves we're different. We have central banks, fiat currencies, complex financial instruments that the Romans couldn't imagine. But the fundamental equation hasn't changed. You cannot spend more than you produce forever. You cannot debase your currency without consequences. You cannot avoid hard choices indefinitely. Rome learned this lesson the hard way over 3 centuries of decline. The question facing us today is whether we'll learn it from Rome's example, or whether future historians will study our collapse the same way they study theirs, wondering why we didn't see the warning signs that in retrospect were so obvious. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And right now, Rome's financial epitaph is starting to sound uncomfortably familiar. If this documentary made you think differently about economics and history, subscribe for more deep dives into how past empires collapsed and what we can learn before it's too late.